Well, greetings, listeners in Listenerland. This is Arnold Stricker with Mark Langston of St. Louis in Tune. We'd like to welcome you to the show today. Man, I tell you what, I remember back when I was a kid and my parents would drive us downtown. We would maybe see at Christmas time at Famous Bar and Sticks Bear and Fuller, I'm dating myself now, the windows with the trains and all that stuff. Right. And we would drive down by the riverfront and you would get this wonderful smell of licorice.
Oh.
Man, I tell you, it was like you could taste it in the air. It was so good. And there is a book that's coming out. It's called Candymen. And our guest today has spent the last 30 years producing television programs for PBS, locally and nationally. He's a 5-time Emmy Award winner, created documentaries, weekly series, musical variety shows, and he's hosted the St. Louis Speaker Series from Powell Hall for the last 22 years, interviewing more than 150 of the world's most renowned artists, writers, adventurers, and political leaders. He is also an artist. He loves his woodcuts. He does a great job with his woodcuts.
What is he? The woodworking? Is that like...
No, like a woodcut where you put art or put ink on it and you print.
Oh,
and
okay.
they're very good.
Okay.
But he spent his boyhood hearing family stories about the Switzer Licorice Company, where his father, grandfather, and great grandfather worked as candy men. Patrick Murphy, welcome to St. Louis in Tune.
Well, thank you for having me.
Man, I tell you what, I think I saw you last in the Schnucks parking lot in Webster Groves. You were driving your convertible, and I was like, there's Patrick over there in the parking lot.
Yeah.
Really, Schnucks nowadays is about the extent of my social life. If I have any social life, it's usually at Schnucks.
Well, we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk about this book, and it's not printed yet, and let's kind of get that off the table. When's it coming out?
It's supposed to come out October 1st, but I hear it might come out a few days earlier. So it could come out just about any time. But it's scheduled for release on October 1st, and then it hits the bookstores, wherever fine books are sold. And you can also order it at candymenthebook.com. We make that easy for you as well.
Okay, and we'll reiterate those things. Now, what was the impetus behind writing the book? Obviously, there's a connection there.
There is, and I never really thought that this would be the material for a book until my wife and friends, and we would tell stories, and people would say, hey, that would make a great book. And so I finally decided that just to do it. I grew up spending a lot of time down on the Landing, when it was basically, it wasn't before it was an entertainment district, when it was just a warehouse district with factories, and because my father worked at Switzer's Licorice, and as you said, and his father worked at Switzer's Licorice, and my great-grandfather started the company with Fred Switzer.
Oh, wow.
My great-grandfather was born in Dublin, Ireland, and he worked in his family's candy store in Dublin, and then he got involved with the Irish rebellions, and they were going to hang him. So
Ooh.
He got on a boat and came to America, and this is about 1870, and all he knew was how to make candy from his candy store background. So he married a woman he came to St. Louis. He moved into Kerry Patch, which was the Irish slum on the near north side. It's where all the Irish lived. And he married a woman named Margaret Switzer, and she had a younger brother named Fred. Switzer sounds German, but it's actually Irish, long story. And they started this little candy company out of their tenement. They made the kitchen in the stove in their tenement, and Murphy made it, and Switzer sold it on a push cart around the Landing and around Kerry Patch for like a penny a piece.
Wow.
And eventually they started a factory in the 1880s down right between where the legs of the arch would be right now on First Street. And then in 1911, they moved into the famous factory by the Eads Bridge, where if you're of a certain age, you will remember this Switzer candy company right at the Eads Bridge with this gigantic candy bar on the side.
Exactly.
So it was probably the most conspicuous factory anywhere because it was right there at the Eads Bridge. And once they tore down all the buildings in the 40s, just about any picture of them building the arch has a picture of Switzer's peeking out there from behind somewhere. And we grew up, my brother and I, going down to the factory all the time to visit my dad. And so we knew the factory backwards and forwards. We would actually go into the drying rooms and pick out a handful of the Switzer's licorice when it was still baking.
Oh, man.
And go up to the roof of the factory where the machine shop was. And at the time, I remember watching them build the arch with a mouthful of Switzer's licorice. And
did you like black or red? Which what do you prefer?
That is always the question: black or red?
Yeah.
And this reflects my age, I guess. Old people like the black.
Yeah, my dad loved the black. My dad loved the black.
There's nothing like the black.
And,
yeah, that's good. It's
oh,
good.
the black is wonderful.
It is.
I mean, but
if you've never had it.
if I regard that as being kind of a purist. I mean, the black is the real stuff,
Okay,
you know.
all right.
And then in the 1950s, they started making the red. That eventually started outselling the black, and now Switzer's it went out of business. We could talk about that, and then it came back in business, and now they're selling all kinds of different flavors, like lemonade and
Raspberry.
cherry cola, and all kinds of stuff. But I love that factory. It was like a 19th century gravity-driven factory with belts and gears, and it was just this crazy center of activity. And I just always loved the place.
I always loved when we were down in that area, like you were talking at the landing. You couldn't miss that building. You couldn't miss the sign next to Eads Bridge, and you couldn't miss the smell. The smell it's kind of like driving south on 55 when they're brewing beer down at AB, and you just can't miss that smell at all.
Can I ask, what is fresh licorice like coming right off the assembly line? It's got to be different than after it's set around for a while.
It's more like kind of almost like a sweet bread. Because they bake it more like bread rather than like a chocolate candy. So it's a little bit doughy, and it's warm, and it tastes like this, anise licorice flavor.
Yeah.
And it's just still just thinking about it brings back all these.
I bet.
You're making my mouth water.
Well,
I mean, I can still smell it. If I think about it, I can smell it, because it wasn't just the landing for me. That's the way my dad smelled.
Yeah.
Like the door would open, and you'd come in from work, and there'd be the smell of anise that would go through the house. And that's how his father smelled.
Yeah.
And I guess that's how his father smelled.
Oh, yeah.
It's the Murphy family smell.
Yeah.
So there was some family recipe that your great grandfather brought over, and what distinguished that particular kind of candy recipe from other candies that were being produced, or was that the only licorice going around at the time in St. Louis? Because it became a national and international kind of, frankly, licorice.
It did. Well, the big competition was Twizzlers. And that was different. It was harder, and it was like strings of licorice. Switzer sold bars and bites, and later they had like lariats, which were long pieces of licorice like a rope. But it's interesting because when the candy company started out, it was chocolates and creams and a thing they called buttermells, and it was like candy, like what you think of as being in a box of candy. Mm-hmm. And then around the time of the First World War, they started producing licorice because licorice started becoming popular in America. Boy, I've learned a lot about the candy industry for sure, doing the research for this. And it started becoming popular, but they changed completely over to licorice right before World War II started because of sugar rations. So that's when they became licorice, because licorice is like sweet on its own and doesn't require sugar. So they dropped all of the other candies, and they strictly went with licorice. And after the war, they just never went back, and it was Switzer's Licorice. The company had a few names before that. At one time, it was called the Yellow Jacket, Switzer Yellow Jacket Company, and because they made a candy called Yellow Jackets. But it's really been Switzer's Licorice since World War II. But yeah, they made all kinds of different candies.
Wow.
Now, you mentioned, I think, in the book about you correct me if I'm wrong, your grandfather who knew all the names of the children's names of the men who swept the factory floor. He would check out the baking process. He would do a lot of things. He was a very humble kind of guy.
he was kind of a funny guy. He was born in 1847, and he died in 1932. So I never knew him, but I heard so many stories about the guy growing up that I sort of felt like I knew him, and I knew his kids, my grandfather and his brothers. But he was again, as I said, he got involved in the Irish nationalist movement, and there was a rebellion in 1867 outside of Dublin, and he got involved in it. And they didn't catch him, but they saw his name on a list of people who, if they caught him, they were going to hang him. So he came to the United States, again, just knowing about licorice. But he was like a sugar whisperer. He could make candy out of just about almost anything because he'd grown up in Dublin making it, and then he traveled around the United States for a while working in different places, learning how they made it in America. But he was just real hands-on, as you said. Like he knew how to make it. He would go down and he would buy the butter and the sugar from the markets. And he even had a trick. You couldn't do it now, but he knew that if you bought butter that was just slightly rancid, again, this is like 1890. I don't think you could do it now. It made for a better caramel. And he would he'd work on the machinery. But he was also funny. After they forgave him for being a rebel, he would go back to Ireland every few years and just disappear for a few months and then come back to America. So he was just kind of a character. Really enjoyed roaming and making licorice. Kind of a carefree guy. Where Switzer, his brother-in-law, he was more the businessman, the marketing guy. And in fact, the name of the company was Murphy Switzer when they started out. And in 1893, there was a Great Depression. It was called the Panic of '93. And the company went bankrupt. So Fred Switzer's sister, another sister, bought the company and gave it to her younger brother. So one morning in 1893, my great-grandfather woke up and discovered that there was not a Murphy Switzer company. There was a Switzer company, and he was out of a job.
Wow.
So he got all ticked off and went to Boston and took the family and wasn't going to come back. And then finally, Fred Switzer coaxed him back because Fred knew how to sell licorice, but he didn't know how to make licorice. And so they got back to a business again around 1903, 1904, around the time of the World's Fair. And that was the beginning of 3 generations of Switzers and Murphys all working together at the same plant. So there was always a generation of Switzers, always a generation of Murphys for like 100 years.
Wow.
So yeah, it's a tradition like that just really kind of gets in your. And I would tell these stories, and I just thought they were family stories, and I was surprised that people found them interesting.
Yeah, because there was Patrick, there was a couple factories. There was one, I guess, like you said, down near the arch, and then they moved to the one that we kind of all knew, and then it had its own little end that has a story in itself. But they were very prolific in making the licorice, and were very successful right away, it seems like.
They were, and they started selling it all over the country. And again, they had competition, and there was, there were other companies. There was a lot of competition for candy just in St. Louis. There was Mavrokos. That was a family business, a Greek family.
Wow.
There was the Dunham Coconut Factory, where they made coconut for candy bars. There were all of these. In fact, there were close to 100 candy companies, like in 1910 in St. Louis. And I think one of the reasons was because there were so many immigrants. My family's Irish, but Greeks and Germans and different people all had their own candy tradition, and so St. Louis became a real candy center in the United States.
Now you saw you mentioned that you saw some movies from your grandparents on. Let's see, I got to get the street correct here. Lockwood. And what kind of stands out in those memories that lingered and that kind of transferred to the book?
Well, those of you who know Webster, which is probably a lot of you, know where Big Bend and Lockwood come together. And the house is still there, 525 East Lockwood. And my family moved there my great-grandfather, they moved out of the city. They moved out of Carey Patch. They went from Shanty Irish to Lace Curtain Irish. They moved to Webster when Webster was kind of like a new place to come, to get out of the soot and dirt of the city. In 1909, they moved to Lockwood, and they lived there. And then his son bought the house next to them on Lockwood. And the houses are still there. The neighborhood looks very much the same. And I found, over the course of doing this research, I found in an old box that belonged to my parents this old canister of film. And on the front of it said, Murphy family, December 1930. And I just about went nuts.
Yeah.
I could hardly get my hands on. I had no idea what was on it. I couldn't get my hands on an old projector fast enough. And I got one, and I turned it on, and I was absolutely amazed. It was like 9 minutes of the family, the whole family, in December of 1930, Christmas. So everybody was there, and they were all out in the front yard. And what was crazy is the neighborhood looks the same, but they're old Model A Fords going down Lockwood, and there are wooden streetcars, going past. There's where Cyrano's is. That's like a car dealership. So the whole family is standing out there mugging. The men are wearing fedoras and long coats, and the women are wearing, old 1930s clothes. And everybody is in it. And then in this one scene, and they're all mugging to the camera like people do. And in this one scene, it flashes to the old guy himself, the guy who came from Dublin, Joseph Murphy. And there's this close shot of him with his sons. My grandfather, who's only in his 30s in this. And they're all looking, when I was looking at it, it was as they were looking right straight at me. And it was a really funny, very funny feeling, as if I was actually connecting with these people who I'd seen in photographs, but I'd never actually seen them move as if they were alive.
Wow.
So that was quite a find. And I took the whole film and I gave it to Tom Cooper at the Webster Library. So he's got it on file there if anybody wants to see it.
Yeah, to talk about them speaking to you from the past, like, hey, get this book written, get all these fancy stories in here.
I know, and my grandfather, my grandfather's brother, Fred, he lived like to be almost 90 years old. So I actually knew the guy, and he grew up in Carey Patch. Like he was in the First World War. He worked at the factory when it was where the arch is, and I was so lucky because in 1967, my dad and his brother interviewed him on those tiny little reel-to-reel tapes that they had back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And years ago, I was working at a radio station, and I actually put them all on cassettes, hoping that a modern technology like cassettes would endure forever.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go figure.
And so I had like hours of the family sitting around where Uncle Fred, is talking about family history and about the factory and about what it was like.
Oh, how great.
And that was an incredibly rich source of information. And it's funny. It's an Irish family, right? So, throughout the entire interview, you can hear the clinking of ice in glasses and, the pouring of drinks,
right.
So
right.
it was funny. But, I mean, what a gift that was, too. So between the film and the interview and just memories of, family stories, hearing them all talk about, and I call it Candyman because that's what they made, candy. And they would proudly, when they'd get together, the men in the family would all kind of puff up and go, we're Candyman. That's what they were.
Good for them.
We're Candyman. And
so they called themselves Candyman then. They were proud of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. And I like to think that Uncle Fred is looking down and thinking, yeah, good going, Patrick. Thanks for telling this story.
Aw, he's probably right.
That's great. We're talking to Patrick Murphy. He's the author of an upcoming book that's coming out October the 1st called Candymen, the story of Switzer's Licorice. And you can get that book at candymenthebook.com, candymenthebook.com. I love this statement that it's kind of a, what do they call those things that are a motto? It's a motto.
Okay.
We eat as much as we can and we sell the rest.
That's Mike Switzer, who is the grandson of Fred Switzer, the founder. And well, that's an interesting part of the story too. Why don't we get into that a little bit? There's there's no reason to believe that Switzer's ever would have survived what it survived, because it was sold to a company called Beatrice Foods in 1966. So it went from a little family factory, 150 people making licorice there by the Eads Bridge. And then this is the 60s, so it's the age where corporations start buying other corporations. So Beatrice bought it. The quality starts to decline naturally because they're into making money. It wasn't the family thing, where I'm going to guard the recipes with my life and we're going to produce quality candy. So and then they sold it to another company, which sold it to another company,
wow.
which by the 1990s was owned by Hershey's, and Hershey's just killed it.
They didn't care.
They took it off. They had their own licorice, and so they didn't need it. So there's no licorice. They're not making it anymore. The brand is gone.
Right.
Yeah.
The old factory, they've been there since 1911. It was this landmark in St. Louis with the big candy bar on the side of the Eads Bridge, the smell. There's a storm in July of 2006. It had been abandoned for 20 years since it had been sold to a bigger corporation. And they've been planning to turn it into a hotel and a casino, and nothing ever happened of it. So in July of 2006, it blew. A good part of it blew down, and it was a bad storm, and it tore off the east wall. Then they kind of dithered around with it. They didn't know exactly what to do. They thought maybe they could fix it up again. And in 2007, it was just in such bad shape they tore it down. So there's no brand, no licorice, and now no factory, no building, no trace that it had ever existed in people's memories. And a few years passed, and Michael Switzer, who was an ad guy in St. Louis, Curly Switzer Ad Agency, they did a lot of work. He had sold his company and was really into brands and really appreciated good legacy brands. And it occurred to him, bam, I've got one just right in my own front yard here, Switzer's Licorice. And what about the idea of bringing it back? So he checked out all of the laws and the copyrights and trademarks and all of that, and went into business with a Webster guy, Dan Warner. Some of your audience might know Dan, and they reinvigorated the factory, and now they're selling it all across the country right now. Cracker Barrels, dollar stores, Straub's, Schnucks. And the headquarters is actually located on North Gore. That's where the office is. So this full cycle comes around, and it ends up in Webster, and they're doing great. And it's on its way to become, again, a leading manufacturer and distributor of licorice. And they've got a bunch of brands now. It's just not black and red. They've got all of these brands that zing and pop like lemonade and cherry cola, and so they're back in business. So the story has this sort of resurrection aspect to it, which is kind of cool. Wow. Great story arc, struggling, Irish American families break out of the poverty of North St. Louis, start a candy factory, hums along, does great, totally goes belly up, busts, and comes back from the dead.
Yeah, from the ashes.
And that factory's here in St. Louis area?
From the Phoenix, yeah.
Actually, right now they're manufacturing it with all of the original recipes, but they're actually physically manufacturing it not in St. Louis, out of state.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the book, I actually have an electronic copy, so I would sound halfway intelligent when I talk to you right now.
I was surprised at how your questions. It's like, has he read the book? By the way, thank you. Thank you.
The pictures and the artifacts, the signs, the photographs, I'm looking at something about the first labor union, which I'm going to ask you in a minute here, but they're just full of just wonderful kinds of artifacts of the factory and of your family and of the history of licorice, and it's just great.
There are almost 100 photographs in the book. And, of course, being from TV, I think of the pictures first, don't let the words get in the way of the pictures, And
right.
Publishing is really different from broadcasting.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But, it's a book that you can I think you can really get off in the photographs, as well as the brilliantly told story.
Well, tell the story about the pretty chewing gum girls who form a union.
Oh, this is funny, and I've got a picture of the front page. The Post is okay. In 1900, there was this vicious streetcar strike. It's pretty famous. I mean, people were killed. There was the streetcar workers were on strike, and the working class people of the city were solidly behind these working men and women of the streetcars. And Fred Switzer, this just attests to what a great marketing guy he was. He was not a pro-labor union guy by any means at all. But there's a story in the Post-Dispatch with like drawings of these 7 young women with this great headline that says, "Pretty chewing gum girls form union." Well, the young women who wrapped the chewing gum, which they made at the time, in wrappers, had formed a quote-unquote union. You get more and more into the story, and you realize this is not really a union at all. This is something that Fred Switzer worked out with a couple of the young women so he could have union label stamped on everything that went out because the public sympathy was so pro-union. So, and it's so funny. I mean, talk about how politically incorrect this article is. This is 1900, July of 1900. Pretty chewing gum. Yeah. And the article, I don't have the words in front of me right now, but it was the leader of the union, the president of the local, an attractive young woman, full-figured yet not stout, with a look of intelligence in her eyes, like full lips and a pleasant voice. So after like 3 paragraphs of what she looks like, they finally get around to her ideas on organized labor, and it's like, we don't want Mr. Switzer or anyone to think that we aren't very happy here, and we don't want to raise, and our working conditions are wonderful. We just want to show our support for the streetcar workers, So I mean, funny, and what a great marketing, trick.
Absolutely.
It was.
I had forgotten that they had made chewing gum.
I didn't even know.
They made
idea.
chewing gum. I mean, I think they just tried almost everything at one point or another. Chewing gum, candy, caramel, a thing called buttermills, and something called the chocolate soldier, which wasn't shaped like a soldier. It stood up to St. Louis heat like a soldier. That was sort of the marketing. Yeah, so Mike Switzer, he's got this great attitude towards the company. He just loves the licorice, and you're right. His slogan is, "We eat as much as we can and we sell the rest," which I think is pretty cool. Hey, we're adapting this to an hour-long television show for Channel 9.
Yeah.
Huh. Oh, really?
Yeah, that's cool.
That would
Channel 9 liked the idea, so I'm in the process now of adapting it to a television show, which is supposed to be finished by next June. It'll be like an hour-long pledge special, So that's kind of fun too.
That's not in your wheelhouse, is it at all?
Right? No,
I don't have any idea how to do that. Yeah.
Here's another one of these. What I would call a cartoon ad that's in the book. It says, "Figures don't lie. It's the low-calorie candy. Figures show Sweet Delicious Switzers is lower in calories than most other popular candy bars."
Yeah. I mean, it's funny the way they try to sell it. And then in the 1960s, they hire a marketing company, which comes up with all these goofy ideas. Like they have a little character called Albert Switzer. Get it? Like Albert Schweitzer. Albert Switzer, boy explorer. And as I said in the book, it didn't really go over very well because a lot of people didn't associate the early 20th century missionary philosopher Albert Schweitzer with licorice, and then it was take a trip to Switzerland, it survived.
Wow.
It didn't some really bad marketing back there in the 60s.
They didn't pay for
it. So it was, and it was like this advertising agency was, this marketing company was saying, licorice, you got to rebrand it. You've got to come up with something new. A lot of people associate it with the Depression and penny candy. You've got to get a new angle to it.
Right.
And
whatever.
So, But people who like licorice. I hear from a lot of people who have memories of being a child, and their folks would bring it home and they would devour it. In our family, it was a basic food group.
I'm a bit surprised you didn't work at the factory, Patrick.
I think there was a time when I was a young teenager where I just thought that's what you did.
Yeah.
That you just grew up and worked at the factory because
how many generations?
It was like a concept, and like I was the first of the, I was first generation to be able to go to college. My parents were World War II and the Great Depression, and before that, there was a lot of things that kept people from going to family. So my folks were, no, you're not going to work at the factory. You're going to get an education.
And go into radio. And you're going to work in radio. Right. Sorry.
We want you to do something that makes a major contribution to society.
Okay.
Hey, I can make this joke, right?
Yes, that's right. There you go.
Yes, you can. Okay.
In fact, I think, Mark, didn't you and I work at a station? Was it KGLD or didn't you and I work at a radio station 25 years ago or somewhere?
It was probably even longer. I can't. Yes, it was one of those.
He looks older than that, Patrick.
It was one of those. It was one of those. It's a brief moment.
I think something happened 10 years ago, and then somebody shakes his head and goes, "No, Patrick, that was 25 years ago." So
that's right.
Now, whenever I refer to anything in the past, I just tack on an extra 20 years.
That's probably that's the best way to go.
You talked about that Albert Switzer, and it's the Try Switzer's bites. And I was telling Mark off air during the break that I remember those little bite-sized things. What used to do is stick them on my teeth, and I'd have this mouthful of black teeth.
Right. Well, you still do have black teeth. I just, people can't see that, but he does.
Dan Warner, the co-owner now, Dan Warner is a good friend of mine. He used to snake the they called them lariats. They were about 36 inches long, and they were like ropes made out of licorice. And he would snake it up his sleeve and out his cuff, so that when he went to Priory, so he could eat candy during class and the monks wouldn't catch him.
That's tremendous. That's tremendous.
There's something magical about candy, and it's the first consumer decision you ever make. Your parents give you a dime and say, "Here, go buy some candy." Maybe it's $1 now. It used to be a dime. Yeah. So it's one of the first decisions you get to make about what you want to buy as a kid. It's something that you associate with wonderful memories. It's a product that's more fun to share than to enjoy alone. So there's this magic of candy that we carry around in our brains that makes it something special. I mean, I don't know if the Murphys and the Switzer made hinges for screen doors. I don't know if it'd make as interesting a book.
No, it wouldn't.
Only if it could eat them.
Right.
It would be very interesting.
It's great St. Louis memories. And as a side comment and a kind of a sidebar deal, your interest in art. And your interest in working on the woodcuts and how you've done that. Where did that spring from?
I've just always sort of been interested in art and painting, and I retired full-time from Channel 9 about 3 years ago. Now I do independent projects for them and documentaries and music shows, variety shows, things like that. But I had more time, and so I just kind of fell into the wood cutting, where you take basically a piece of plywood and you draw a picture on it, and then you cut out the part that you want to be white and leave the part you want to be black, and then you roll ink over it and run it through a printing press. And I thought I'd do a couple of them, and I fell in love with the process, the black and the white and the contrast. And I just really got interested in it. And so, I started hanging out with more artists, and I started getting in shows like the Shaw Art Fair, and I started exhibiting at some of the galleries in St. Louis, and started selling it, which is fun. I mean, it's always nice to know that it's not just like your wife and your friends who like it, but somebody is actually willing to pay for it. You say, "Hey, this is valid. Right. This is validating."
It is validating.
And no, thanks for mentioning that. It's something that I really enjoy.
Do you like that over? Have you done linoleum cuts, or have you worked in other mediums like pastels or oils?
No, watercolors mostly, and the wood printing. No, not linoleum, because I like the way the wood kind of fights back and has its own opinions about what it wants to be. Mm-hmm. So it's like the linoleum is so easy. It's like, oh, you want to go over here? Fine, let's go over there. It's like working with linoleum is hanging out with a friend who always wants to do what you want to do. You know, you want to eat Chinese? Yeah, we'll eat Chinese. You want to go to a movie? Yeah, we'll go to a movie. You know, that's linoleum. Wood is, oh, you think you want to go this way? Well, you know, buddy, I got grain, you know, and we're not going that way. So it's more of a collaboration between the wood and your little idea of what you think the picture ought to look like.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that insight, because that's
anybody who wants to see this stuff, I think the website is pmurphystl.com. pmurphystl.com. And there are probably about 20 or 30 woodcuts there that you can enjoy if you like. Don't confuse that with CandymanTheBook.com. That's totally different.
Oh, no. No, I know.
No.
You are correct. And let's give them both out here. So we have pmurphystl.com. That's Patrick's gallery site. And but the one that we're talking with him about, which is CandymanTheBook.com, you can get a copy of Candyman, the story of Switzer's Licorice. It's published by Reedy Press. And again, if you enjoy history and licorice, this book is for you. It's I love that it's nice and concise. If you're from St. Louis, you must get this book, because I think you should have had a scratch and smell thing on this. It would have been a bestseller for sure. It would have been a New York Times bestseller.
Right. They would have liked it in New York. Yeah.
Hey, it's early in the game. Who knows?
That's true.
Might be. Yeah.
Patrick Murphy, thank you very much for joining us today on St. Louis in Tune. Patrick, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Patrick.
Hey, this was fun, and thank you so much for the time. You guys do a wonderful job. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick. Take care.